placed unexpectedly on the roof of his chantry chapel. Within is one of the earliest and most delicate examples of fan vaulting in the country. Seven windows adorn the clerestory of the sanctuary, full of lovely 14th century stained glass. They were almost certainly the gift of Hugh's mother, Eleanor de Clare, and the kneeling figure, naked and symbolizing the renunciation of worldly goods, is believed to be Eleanor herself. Hugh and his wife gave the wonderful vault, built of the local Cotswold limestone. What a splendid enrichment it is, especially here over the sanctuary. This is a lierne vault, from the French word lier, to tie. The liarns are the short rooms which tie the main ones together to produce this exquisite, purely ornamental design. At every point of junction there is a carved boss, originally painted and gilded. Then, after the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471, the Yorkists commemorated their victory over the Lancastrians by adding their emblem, a circle of gilded suns. What a glorious extravagance! Visually, though, it isn't the battle, but the church which dominates our thoughts here. A grand, brooding presence, constantly in view. It survives almost intact because, at the dissolution, the town, to its eternal honour, paid Henry VIII £453 to purchase the monastic parts. A big sum in those days, equivalent to at least £60,000 today. From the top of the tower, all of 205 steps up, we can learn a lot. Away to the west we see the two rivers, the Avon in the foreground, and across a few meadows, half a mile away, the Severn. Until the Industrial Revolution, a river was nearly always the key to an inland town's prosperity. When roads were bad, and in winter sometimes impassable, barges were the only convenient way of transporting bulky goods. For water transport, Tewkesbury was very well placed, although I dare say some of you are wondering why the town wasn't sited a little away at the junction of the two rivers. The answer, which still applies, is because of flooding. In the Middle Ages, valley beds were much more often waterlogged than they are today. But even now, these pastures are sometimes under water. That's why they're so lush. The town that grew up to serve the abbey had rather an odd plan. A long wedge shape with the three principal streets forming a Y. The reason it couldn't expand was because it was hemmed in on three sides by the danger of flooding, and to the east by abbey lands and the manorial estate. So even in the Middle Ages, this was always a congested place. And one of the things that will strike us most is the contrast between the all-stone church and the town in which stone is very much the exception. Now, the stone for the church came from a number of different quarries, not all of which have been identified. Some almost certainly came from Breedon, which is the nearest source of supply, 6 or 7 miles away. A good deal of the stone certainly came from the Cotswolds. From various quarries, they may have been as much as 15 miles away. But At least the journey was all either downhill or on the level, so it was not impossible. Tewkesbury's few stone buildings are nearly all close to the abbey. This is the handsome early Tudor gatehouse. The rather yellow limestone came from Guyting in the Cotswolds. Between the gatehouse and the abbey is the abbey house, now the vicarage, which, although much altered, was the lodging, or possibly the guest house, of the medieval abbots. It has a beautiful early Tudor oriel window, also in Cotswold stone. But the rest of the stone is mostly blue lass. Now this was quarried only 2 miles away to the north, Twinning. So it is really the one local stone that Tewkesbury has. But it's so soft that, you see, it flakes away like this. So hardly anybody used it if they could find anything else. Stone was de rigueur for the abbey and the monastic buildings, but it was too expensive for the townspeople. They built in wood and plaster. In the alleys which survive as part of the congested medieval plan, there's still plenty of wood. And behind the main street houses, there might be a lofty hall, a workshop, or perhaps a barn. Until the closing years of the 17th century, Tewkesbury was essentially a timber-framed town, and survivors are still plentiful. This is the most familiar of Tewkesbury's timber-framed houses, a faintly intoxicated-looking building with overhanging upper stories making their obeisance to passers-by. The gables here nod much more than usual, because the ridge pieces broke and had to be secured. These overhanging stories are known as jetties. Apart from their undeniable picturesqueness, it used to be said that the reason why jetties were so popular was that they gave people more floor space upstairs, which is undoubtedly true. In congested places like Tewkesbury, this would no doubt have been very welcome. Yet, in fact, the justification of the jetty was purely structural. Think of upstairs rooms full of furniture, heavy oak beds, tables, chests, and so on. In the course of time, the joists which carry these pieces will be almost certain to sag. But if these joists project into space and are weighted at their outer ends by having to carry upper walls and part of the roof, the effect is one of counterpoise. A jetty is therefore a source not of weakness, but of strength. Remember, too, that in the 16th century, when these houses went up, there were no gutters and no drain pipes. The rainwater just poured off the roof. Now, lime plaster is very vulnerable to water. So the jetties were also useful in throwing the water clear of the walls. That, in the process, it spouted on the heads of the passers-by. It was just too bad. The timbers in Tudor and Jacobean times were, it seems, never black. permanent black wasn't to be had until tar and pitch, distilled from coal, became available, and that wasn't until the 19th century. Black and white, which we associate mainly with the western counties and the north, was essentially a Victorian fashion. It became so popular that sometimes, as here, the timbers, or some of them, are a sham, just painted on the brick. All the same, it's an exciting arrangement of gables, with 3 overhanging stories. My own decided preference is for the oak to be left in its natural state, unblacked, as in the carefully restored 17th century house which is now a museum. This house has a continuous range of casement windows, all with leaded lights. Revealed oak too, though here somewhat bleached, is seen in the recent restoration of a long range of late medieval houses now known as abbey cottages. They were very dilapidated, and the ground floor walls had been built out, so that the effect of the jetties was lost. Most of these are now visible again. Two of the houses had been refronted in the Georgian period, and they have quite rightly been left. The restoration of the others cost over £100,000, but on a site so close to the abbey, it was money well spent. William Morris would surely have approved, because it was about the proposed over-restoration of the abbey itself in 1877 that he wrote the famous letter, which not only stopped it, but led to the foundation of the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings. That splendid body is still going strong. In the High Street is an example of what I'd call misguided restoration. The gables and the jetties have survived, 3 of them, but the house has been cement rendered all over and coloured green. This house, built in the 15th century, lost 2 of its 3 gables when it was reconstructed about 1630. But at the same time it gained the finest plaster ceiling in the town. It's surprisingly sumptuous for so modest a house. The fertile floodplain surrounding the town provided it with lush cornfields, and as early as the 12th century the Avon had been diverted to power the Abbey Mill. The original watermill doesn't, of course, survive. This is a replacement of the late 18th century. The weatherboarded part isn't even as old as that. Milling stopped here about 1928, and it's now a restaurant. The principal industry before the 17th century was wool and the weaving of cloth. Tewkesbury also had a flourishing market. And writing in 1586, William Camden tells us that Tewkesbury was also famous for its smart biting mustard. In fact, if you wanted to suggest that somebody was specially strong, there was an old saying, "He looks as if he lives on Tewkesbury mustard." Later, to supplement the corn trade came malting and leather goods, especially saddles. Then knitting. About 1723, Daniel Defoe came to Tewkesbury and noted a large populous town famous for a great manufacture of stockings. And this was still true a century later, when 1 inhabitant in every 4 was knitting stockings. Today there's another flour mill by the Avon dating from 1865, which is now Tewkesbury's biggest industrial building. This time they used brick. Since the 18th century, brick-making had become another of the town's flourishing industries. Beside the Severn there was plenty of suitable clay, so brick became fashionable. Tewkesbury prospered, and in just over a century the population doubled. In 1723 it was 2,866, in 1831 5,780. But not everybody could afford to rebuild. The brick is sometimes only skin deep. Look at this. Timber frame behind, isn't it? No doubt about it. But the front is brick. This was a coaching inn, the Star and Garter. The windows don't look right for a Georgian front. They're too square. 4 lights by 4 rather than 3 across and 4 up, which was the best Georgian practice. This is because it was impossible to achieve Georgian proportions with the low rooms of the earlier timber-framed house. Taxes on windows and on glass were a scourge of the late Georgian age. To avoid them, people kept blocking up their windows. This house lost no fewer than 6. The long garden front of the Abbey House, now the vicarage, shows Georgian windows as they should be. 3 lights across and 4 up. These gracious sash-frame windows not only retain all their glazing bars, but also their original crown glass too. Early window glass, like stained glass, was blown in cylinders or muffs, which were split along their length and then gradually flattened out as they cooled. Now, the process with crown glass was quite different. There, the glass blower inserted his pipe into the furnace and gathered a globule of red-hot metal, as he called it. And then he took a wooden bat, and keeping the thing spinning the whole time, he spread out this molten globule until it took the form of a disc of glass, which could be anything from 3 to sometimes even 5 feet in diameter. Must have been absolutely marvelous to watch. Crown glass has a natural fire finish, which gives it a special brilliancy. It can often be identified by its rippling reflections. But for more than a century it's been unobtainable, having been completely supplanted by machine-produced glass in sheets big enough to need no glazing bars. They've all gone here at Kingsbury House, except in the 2 so-called Venetian-style windows in the centre. At Avonside, the ground floor windows have lost their glazing bars. What a wretched deprivation. Faces without features. The same is true of Riverside House and of a number of others. But at least they still have good fanlights over the doors. A special characteristic of Tewkesbury's Georgian buildings is the key block of moulded terracotta over the centre of each window. These blocks, usually painted white, display a variety of decorative motifs. These houses belong to the years of Tewkesbury's greatest prosperity and provide a perfect foil to its earlier half-timbering. Within, too, there are survivals of Georgian elegance, such as this staircase with its nicely carved tread ends and balustrade. To find this staircase here is a delightful surprise, for despite the castellated rainwater heads dated 1701, the front of this building was marred in 1897 by mock timber framing. Towards the end of the 18th century, stone made a brief reappearance. First, in 1788, came the town hall. Then, in 1813, the former National School, both of some distinction, but untypical of Tewkesbury. I feel this is also true of the wrought iron gates to the churchyard, which date from 1734. Untypical perhaps, but how grandly ceremonial. Iron, too, but of a very different nature, cast iron this time, was the material in which in 1823 Thomas Telford designed his Mythe Bridge across the Severn, just outside the town. We know a good deal about the history of this bridge. Before Telford was brought on the scene, it was intended to have 3 arches. But he found that the bed of the river was just soft alluvial clay, and declared that the only way was to have a single span. Here is his design, and Telford himself reckoned it the handsomest bridge which has been built under my direction. The span is 170 feet. It's good engineering and good art. It was opened in 1826. The iron for this bridge was brought down the river all the way from Shropshire, and so indeed was the stone for the abutments. Tewkesbury had always been on the direct north-south road from Bristol to the Midlands. Now came the east-west traffic as well, to Ledbury and to Hereford. By 1830, there were 30 stagecoaches a day passing through or stopping at Tewkesbury. The house of the nodding gables became the ticket office for them. The coaching inns flourished, and it's said that before long this small town, which in 1533 had 20 taverns, now possessed 101 pubs of one kind or another. A few years later, the Birmingham to Bristol Railway was built. This bypassed Tewkesbury and went through Ashchurch. It's only a couple of miles away, but it meant that the Industrial Revolution gave Tewkesbury a miss. The population in 1931 was actually 1,400 fewer than in 1831. There was practically no new building here throughout that period. So, much of Tewkesbury has survived relatively unchanged. And visually, of course, this was a great piece of luck. In this setting, one intruder, the former grammar school of 1906, now the public library, is surely quite enough. It's built of machine-pressed bricks made of hard carbonaceous clay, faultless in their precision, relentless in their durability. The machine-made tiles are equally off-putting, and so is the cresting. The cowl supplies the final coup de grace. Despite the date, which refers to the earlier timber-framed house, this very likeable design is Victorian. The refronting dates from 1845, and it's a real asset to the High Street. The same, alas, can't be said for the shopping development of the 1960s. This is a deplorable design, and totally out of place in Tewkesbury. But the whole of the old town is now a conservation area, and by and large its character has been very well preserved, while some of the buildings are better kept now than they used to be. The appeal largely depends on materials, the right materials in the right place. Oaks from the nearby woods for the timber frame buildings, clay from the banks of the Severn for the brickmaking, and above all stone. Stone only for the public edifices, the town hall, the national school, the abutments of the bridge, and above all, of course, for the abbey, to which here at Tewkesbury our eyes and our thoughts must continually return.